Good afternoon, and welcome to Remaking the Economy in Buffalo. I'm Steve Dubb, and I'm the senior editor here at Nonprofit Quarterly. Thanks for being here. I know we're in a very unusual time. I hope you and your loved ones are safe, and I really appreciate you spending some of your time with us today. The focus of this webinar is on what low-income communities and communities of color are doing in Buffalo to make an economy and society that works for them. Today we'll hear directly from three Buffalo community leaders. Andrew Del Monte is Director of Cooperative Development at People United for Sustainable Housing, also known as Push Buffalo, a broad-based economic justice organization. India Walton is a co-founder and executive director of the Fruitvale Community Land Trust, which develops permanently affordable housing. And Bob Doyle is director of community development at Westminster Economic Development Initiative, better known as WEDI, a nonprofit that supports and incubates immigrant-based businesses. We'll also show a video interview that I conducted earlier this month with Erie County Legislative Chair April Baskin. A few notes before we get started. First, we're really excited to take all your questions. Please keep them coming and put them in your question box in your GoToWebinar control panel, and I will definitely make time to ask those questions to the panelists. Second, we will be sharing the slides of this webinar and recording with everyone via email, so no need for chat messages asking whether we're going to share the slides. We will do so. And finally, we offer this webinar free of charge, but it's not free for us to produce. So please consider a contribution to NPQ today. I also want to thank once more the John R. O'Shea Foundation, which is based in Buffalo and provided a $7,500 matching grant to support this program. And of course, to thank all of you who made that match possible. You can also support our work by joining the conversation, hashtag rebuild the economy. And we will also be having a short survey after the webinar, so please look for that window after our conversation. Thanks again for being with us today. And now I will share a few slides to help frame today's discussion. So next slide, please. So just a reminder, this is part of a series that we've been running for 2 years, and some of our goals are to build awareness, identify examples and best practices, question narratives about the economy, never more critical than today, highlight pathways to changing the economy, and emphasize the links between different community-based efforts. And so here's just a brief overview of Buffalo. At one point, I believe the 8th most populous city in the United States, has had a significant population decline over the past half century, about 44% white, 37% black, with also Latinx, Asian, and Native American residents, and a fairly high poverty rate, if you notice, of 30%. Next slide. Again, Buffalo's history, it was once one of the wealthiest cities in the United States, home to the terminus of the Erie Canal. It was called the City of Light because it was one of the first to electrify, being very close to Niagara Falls. Steel and grain were two of its major industries back at the turn of the last century. By today, the biggest industries are actually education and healthcare, and you can see there's over 100,000 college students at 20 universities in the greater Buffalo area. It's also been a leader in social enterprise, and actually Andrew Del Monte, who's on this call, before he worked for Push Buffalo, helped set up one of the first social enterprise development programs at the Small Business Development Center in Buffalo. Next slide. And here are the organizations that we'll be featuring today: Fruitvale Community Land Trust, People United for Sustainable Housing, and WEDI. And again, this is part of a series every third Thursday of the month, and we'll keep going even if we're operating out of our homes for the rest of the season. Next up will be Fresno in the Central Valley, April 16th, third Thursday of the month at 2 p.m. Eastern. And the last of this series for this year will be in Chicago. And please check out our Economy Remix series as well. And with that, we'll go to the interview with the Honorable April Baskin.
Good afternoon. I'm Steve Dubb, Senior Editor of Nonprofit Quarterly, and we're here with the Honorable April Baskin, Legislator for District 2 and Chair of the Erie County Legislature. Ms. Baskin, welcome to Nonprofit Quarterly.
Thank you for having me.
To begin, could you tell us a little bit about your background and what got you to be involved in local politics?
Sure. I'm a Buffalo native, born and raised, an artist originally by trade. I attended Buffalo Performing Arts High School and went on to earn a degree in theater. So visual arts and theater arts have been my craft for a long time. Later in life, I translated those skills into the classroom and began teaching as a teaching artist in Buffalo and in New York City. I had a passion for fusing the arts and academics. And with that, I learned about a lot of disparities, poverty, and reasons why kids have different learning styles. And that kind of opened up my eyes to wanting to serve more in the community.
What do folks need to know about Buffalo to have a basic understanding of the Nickel City?
Yeah, well, Buffalo is what we call a Rust Belt city. It's definitely blue collar, a post-industrial city that has declined like half of its population since the 1950s. A lot of migrants from the South came up to Buffalo to work in the factories, just like in Detroit, in Cleveland, Pittsburgh. I'm an elected official in Erie County, which is much larger. So the city of Buffalo is just one of 3 cities within the county. And the city of Buffalo in District 2 happens to be one of the poorest districts of the 11 ways that Erie County is split up. It's also, it's 9 zip codes, and 6 of the 9 zip codes fall in New York State's 100 poorest zip codes. We have rich diversity in District 2, which is different than any of the other districts that encompass a little bit of the city of Buffalo, whereas some of the most affluent people in the city reside in District 2, as well as some of the poorest. And District 2 is the district that has primarily African-American constituents and immigrant and refugee.
How is Buffalo addressing equity today?
Well, I mean, in a lot of different ways. I think workforce development is something that we're seeing coming back strong in the city of Buffalo. Redlining is something that the city has dealt with in the past, and I believe it's currently still a relevant issue that people face. Recently, the Attorney General sued one of our local banks for redlining. And so historically, I think this is a city that was set up where people of like ethnicities and like races and like economic statuses flock together. And with that, you will always find an inequity and an opportunity for certain people to benefit while other communities do not.
What are strategies that are actually making a difference on the ground in Buffalo that you would lift up?
Groups that have a mission to make sure that access to housing, workforce opportunities, basic needs like childcare, so that people can have stability in the workforce. Organizations that really have a core focus on providing those types of services to the community are really the ones that are the boots on the ground, helping the people that I represent and the people that I'm most passionate about have an opportunity to kind of get out of their situation.
Could you tell me a story about a group that you worked with that has been able to shift relations of power in the economy?
Yeah, I've been able to work closely with the Western New York Law Center here in my time as a legislator. We've been able to, through a collaboration, develop programs that address vacant and abandoned housing within sections of my district. We were able to develop a proposal for a pilot program for the legislature to consider, wherein houses that have been abandoned or are just simply vacant will have the resources that they need through the Western New York Law Center, providing attorneys to go into communities, work with neighborhoods to rehab these homes or turn them over to different entities that can rehab them. This eliminates vacant and abandoned home crime issues that are associated with things like that, rodents, health issues. That was something that I was very, very pleased to be able to work on. I partnered with Push Buffalo recently, and we're looking into a federal grant that will help with exterior home and some exterior, some interior home repairs for low-income families that actually do own their homes and they're living in their homes, but they're not kept up to par. Equitable and adequate housing is a human right, and working with organizations like the Western New York Law Center and Push Buffalo are actually helping me become a better service provider, being a county representative, and actually addressing real issues. Another organization that I have a good relationship with is LED 716. We were able to develop a program that lowers the threshold just for Erie County. It's also a pilot program that we're rolling out, and we're going to do some testing and get the outcomes and send the outcomes to the state and ask that they amend their recent lead legislation to include more children who have lower levels of lead, because when those children go into kindergarten, first grade, second grade, they are impacted by lead poisoning just at a lower level, but that lower level could still impact their behavioral skills, their academic abilities. So I'm proud of all of these new things that are rolling out in the county that the county's never really done before.
How do you see the role of policy in helping community-based groups, such as the ones we're talking with today, be more effective? You know, how do you build those partnerships?
I think that depends on the legislator and the legislator's accessibility. I mean, the way that I work with these groups is going out to their meetings, introducing myself, listening to their issues, their mission, understanding that they are the groups that are connected to the people, and understanding that my place and my role is that I've been elected by the people to be able to deliver and solve a lot of those issues within the jurisdiction of county government. One example is the Department of Social Services had a policy where a juvenile that was being transferred from the detention facility to their court date had to be cuffed. And there was a situation in the city of Buffalo where a child as young as 8 years old was handcuffed in transition to go before a family court judge. That to me was a policy that just did not make any sense. I felt like it criminalized the child, and it introduced the child to being before a judge and in a court in handcuffs. So in order to get that policy changed, I had to rely on community-based organizations that had done extensive research and were made up of community members that understood the injustice that was happening, and have a healthy relationship with the county executive and the commissioner of Department of Social Services to make sure that they understood the grievance that was occurring and the flaw in this policy. And through those healthy relationships, the Commissioner of Social Services lifted the policy. Unless a child is a threat to themselves or a threat to the officers transitioning them, there's no reason to handcuff children anymore in Erie County when they're being transferred from a detention hall to the courts. Things like that are a big win.
In terms of community economic development, how can local government policy support some of their efforts?
The heartbeat of people's survival depends on how county government operates. It's the reason why Push Buffalo is now consistently in the county budget under my leadership, because I have an understanding of their mission and what they do, and that needs to be a priority in the community. And if these are the people that are getting up every single day, rolling up their sleeves, same thing over at the Land Trust, making sure that people can preserve their right to stay in the neighborhoods that they have lived in all of their life. Yes, county government should not only be involved, but we should be helping structure and finding the funding to make sure that organizations like that are sustainable.
I wanted to ask you one more question, just because it was a project you were involved in, I think before your election, I may get this wrong, the college simulation experience or something. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, your own work in the field?
Sure. So before I got into elected office, I was running my own program, the College Simulation Experience, and it's a theatrical-based simulation of what adult life is like while you're in college. When I had the opportunity to think, how can I help kids not quit school, but understand all of the things that they have to juggle because they're coming from communities that are oppressed, where they might be the first person in their families to try to obtain a college degree. Then also, how can I make it fun? How can it not be boring? How can it be engaging? And that's where the simulation came into play. One day I just created this live game of Monopoly with a false laundromat and a false grocery store and a false bookstore and a false lecture hall. And it was all like this fictional imaginative play. And I did it one day for a group of high school students, and their teacher loved it and called another teacher, and another teacher called a college, and a college called another college. And before you knew it, I had to formulate a business and travel around the entire city of Buffalo just running this 3-hour simulation experience of adult life. The kids were loving it. They were learning. They were asking questions that they wouldn't normally ask a guidance counselor. And I really feel like we were making an impact. At that time, I had no business acumen. I was a single mother on welfare, trying to go to school myself and just figure out my life. But I had found a niche in helping people. And that's why running for office became so fluid for me, because I enjoy helping people. And I think that's what elected officials should do.
Legislator Baskin, thanks so much for participating in this interview with Nonprofit Quarterly.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. And thank you to your team.
And we'll go back to the webinar.
Hi, everyone. I'm with Push Buffalo. We're an organization that was founded in 2005 with the mission of mobilizing residents to create strong neighborhoods that include quality, affordable housing, expanding local hiring opportunities, and advancing economic and environmental justice. In 15 years, we've grown considerably from a very small organization that started with our two founders, Aaron Bartley and Eric Walker, quite literally knocking on community members' doors to find out, what were the issues in the neighborhood and what the neighborhood could organize around in a place-based area on Buffalo's west side, to now we have a staff that swings from 30 to 40, depending on the season. Next slide, please. Our bread and butter for many of those years is to focus on actually solving issues of sustainable housing, both in terms of community organizing around efforts to improve folks' situation with the utility companies, and then actually forming our own community development arm in tandem with that organizing effort to actually build and maintain sustainable units in the neighborhood. And some of the highlights you'll see here on the slide include our hiring hall, actually putting underemployed and unemployed folks to work in good jobs, many of them on those construction projects. Push Green has helped to weatherize over 1,000 homes to date in our place-based neighborhood that we call the Green Development Zone. And then also Push Blue, which is a social enterprise that installs and maintains green infrastructure. And across the city, we've installed about 19 acres worth, diverting wastewater from Lake Erie. Next slide, please. So I love showing this graphic on the left here. This is how we tend to think about how our different areas of work at Push intersect and interrelate. So we have an organizing team that pushes to make change. We have policy advocacy folks that work on policy and strategy efforts at the state, local, and national levels. And then we also engage in demonstration projects. So actually building the affordable housing, like I mentioned, and also forming social enterprises such as Push Blue, the green infrastructure business, and also cooperatives. And we'll get into that in a minute. And it's very important that these three areas of the work, which often are antagonistic at separate organizations, actually work together to create something that is responsive to the community needs. So one project within that green development zone that I mentioned earlier that is a special victory for us is redeveloping an empty public school building, formerly School 77, on Buffalo's west side, which included a multi-year community planning process where we met with the community to find out what was it that could be useful in a facility of this size and in this location. And then we built and designed a project around that. So you'll notice the solar panels on the roof installed by some of our hiring hall workers. There's a green roof that was installed by our Push Blue folks. There's 30 units of senior and affordable low-income housing on the inside, along with a community gym and meeting space. Our offices, Push Buffalo's offices, are now located there, along with space for an after-school program and the Ujima Theater Company. School 77 and the Green Development Zone are rooted in a neighborhood that I bet Bob will talk a little bit more about when we talk about Weedy, because we were in the same area on Buffalo's west side. Has about 60,000 people. It's comprised primarily of people of Puerto Rican, African American, Italian American, Burmese, Somali descent. Something like 30 nations reside in one zip code in this area. And these are the folks that make up the membership of Push Buffalo. And as I mentioned, we have more intentionally focused our efforts around what we call new economy projects by forming a new division at Push. I co-lead the new economy department along with Brianna DeFonso. And we support Push's social enterprises that have been around for a while, our community hiring hall, which is an alternative staffing agency and job placement company for folks to get into the trades, and in particular, green construction trades. And then we also have Push Blue, the green infrastructure social enterprise that essentially acts as a contracting company, putting green infrastructure on all of the properties in Push Buffalo's land bank and our affordable housing projects, but also other projects throughout the community. The solar array on top of School 77 is our first community solar project, and we're hoping to expand to a much larger array soon. As well as Cooperation Buffalo, which is a project that I'll talk a little bit more about in the questions that I helped to start, which is intentionally trying to build economic security for workers in Buffalo through creating and supporting worker-owned businesses. So I think I will hold it there, and I'll talk more during questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. And next up is India. India, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. My name is India Walton. I am the Executive Director of the Fruitvale Community Land Trust here in Buffalo. In real life, I am a registered nurse, and my foray into affordable housing development happened completely by accident and acts of God. What you're seeing on your screen now is a graphic that shows the disparity and just the scale of the Fruit Belt, the neighborhood that I work in, which is on the right side of your screen, as opposed to the Buffalo Niagara Medical Campus, which is a $1 billion public and private investment in infrastructure to build a university and a medical and research campus that really has had some significant impacts on the surrounding neighborhood. Next slide. So like I said before, the Buffalo Niagara Medical Campus is about 120 acres. There's 9 million square feet of research, clinical and support space. There's been almost $1 billion invested in that neighborhood. And the neighborhood adjacent to that, which is called the Fruit Belt, is a historically African-American neighborhood where there's a high percentage of homeowners, but the flip side to that is there's well-documented health disparities. People in the zip code 14204 and 14203 have poorer health outcomes than most individuals in Erie County, and it's a stark contrast to the level of investment that's being made into the medical campus as opposed to the health outcomes of the folks who live a block away, right? So like, why are there people who don't have access to healthcare in walking distance to the largest healthcare institutions, research institutions, and universities in the Buffalo Niagara region. So I think that a lot of the work that we've done has been surrounding those kind of questions. Next slide. The Fruitvale Community Land Trust was birthed out of a community activist issue. The first thing that we worked on was parking, because there are 12,000 people visiting the campus every day. Because the homes in the Fruit Belt are older and don't have driveways, there was an influx of people who chose to park on the streets rather than pay for parking on the campus, and it was a concern of the residents. So we came together first as Community First Alliance, and you can see a lot of the partners that came together to help organize the neighborhood. And as a part of the initial round of organizing, we really sought to come to an agreement with the medical campus that would provide community benefits to the residents. So things like parking relief, affordable housing, relief from medical bills, and just ways that we could encourage the institutions on the campus to be good neighbors to the folks who had existed in that area prior to the medical campus being there. One of the most important things that we were able to accomplish was to get our council president and our Ellicott district council person to pass a moratorium on the sale of any city-owned property in the Fruit Belt, so that we really were able to curtail the speculation and the rise in property values for a time until we could really get the voice of the community and find out what folks who lived in that neighborhood wanted. So we developed a neighborhood plan, which the land trust that I now lead, I guess you could say, was a part of that. So next slide. So here, our community benefits agreement was called the Rising Tide document. There's a saying that says, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? But our moniker was kind of like, you know, a rising tide will drown the people who don't have boats. So how do we ensure that people have boats before the tide rises? So a part of that was affordable housing, workforce and job training, parking relief, and also like how do you reinvest revenues from parking into the community. A lot about historical and cultural preservation. And while we were making, you know, an effort to negotiate these benefits with both the city of Buffalo and the medical campus, one of our leaders said, it won't matter whether we win this or not, because we won't be the community. Who's actually going to benefit from this CBA if we win it, if we're all being pushed out? So that was the moment that we really switched focus to not only trying to reclaim some of the benefits that the medical campus may have had to offer, but how do we keep people in place? And that was ultimately the birth of the land trust through a lot of our partners, such as Push Buffalo, Open Buffalo. We worked with a local think tank called Partnership for the Public Good. So we really got a lot of our beginning capacity from other community organizations, which was a really great thing that allowed us to put community members at the front and center as decision makers. And, you know, the rule was, unless you have 2/3 of leadership from the community who are in agreement, then we don't proceed forward unless this is actually what the community wants. It's not that we're placing something on top of the folks, is that we are building the solution with the people who are experiencing the problem, because you are the experts on your neighborhood and on your community. So we've been in existence for roughly 3 years. That sounds like a long time, but it's really not. We've incorporated, we have our 501c3 status. We have more than 100 members. I'm the first executive director, which is a daunting task, more complicated than I thought. We are currently under contract with Habitat for Humanity to produce our first couple of single-family new builds. We've also acquired a couple of existing homes to do full gut rehabs on. But I think that the most important part of this is, like, this is something that has been done from the ground up, right? There was no benevolent organization that came with the solution that was placed on us. These were things that we figured out together over the course of just a few years, really, and we're learning as we go. But it's been a hell of a ride. Next slide. This slide is just a bit of our partners. We really rely on the folks who are the experts in the field with the knowledge that the people who live in this place are the true experts. So like there's expertise in development, in building, in policy that we rely on our partners for, but the ultimate problem solvers in our community is our community. The people who are closest to the problem are also those who are closest to the solution. And we are true believers in that when a community is resourced and provided with the tools that are needed, we can come up with viable solutions to our own issues. So that's all I have. And thanks.
India, thanks so much. And last up is Bob Doyle from Weedy.
So I'm Bob. I work as the Community Development Director for Westminster Economic Development Initiative. You can go to my first slide. Okay, cool. Thank you. So what is Weedy? Weedy is a nonprofit 501c3. We are a CDFI, which is a community development financial institution. For anybody who doesn't know what that is, it basically just means we are authorized to lend money to people for any kind of business purposes. So we were founded way back in 2006 by the Westminster Presbyterian Church, which is a local church that wanted to find a way to get involved in the community, especially as they saw the refugee population in the neighborhood start to grow. They got together with our Common Council representative, David Rivera, and a number of different community stakeholders to identify what are the biggest needs in our neighborhood right now. When we first started, it was really focused on working with Habitat for Humanity to build housing. And then we kind of retooled our focus to look into more of the microloans and business focus as the neighborhood really decided that was something they needed help with. People really wanted to see people that live in our neighborhood have the opportunity to open businesses here and to be able to stay in place, especially as the neighborhood has started to change over the last few years. So we have three main areas of focus. Our economic development program really is just our micro-lending program. And those are loans of anywhere from a $500 credit building loan for someone who's never had credit before, never had a bank account before, all the way up to $20,000 for capital expenses. Our community development program is what I lead, and that runs Westside Bazaar, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And then we also have education programs that work with English language learners on strengthening literacy and learning how to navigate the school system, help with homework, things like that. All of our students come from homes where English is not spoken in the house, so they don't have anyone at home to actually help them with any of these things. So our portfolio over the last few years has reached about $1 million in lending. This is where these are the businesses most of our money goes to. We work very heavily with Main Street businesses, so people like hair salons, restaurants, transportation companies, anything really. Next slide. My job revolves around Westside Bazaar, which is our small business incubator and international marketplace. We work primarily with members of the refugee community on the West Side to open businesses and then teach people how to run those businesses once they're open. So we were founded in 2011 in a very small storefront with just 6 tables and currently are operating in a space that's about 3,500 square feet with room for up to 18 businesses. We have 15 in there right now. Some of them rent 2 booths because they've kind of outgrown their space. We've worked with over 40 businesses and we have 12 successful graduates. And that does show that some people have closed, but really our main goal is to allow people to open a business somewhere that's safe, that's affordable, and where they have the tools to navigate really what this economic system is. And it's much better to find out business is not for you when you haven't taken out a loan or you haven't spent any money, really, outside of your initial startup costs. We have had a couple really successful graduates. Sesmita Batik, I'll talk about it in my last slide, but she actually just was one of our original vendors and was recently in New York Fashion Week. Global Villages, Gourmet Lao are pretty prominent businesses on the West Side that started in Westside Bazaar. And we have over 30 languages spoken in the space. So it's a pretty diverse mix of business owners and clientele from a pretty diverse mix of countries. Right now, our business owners actually come from 7 different countries, but they represent over 13 ethnic groups. There's a lot of a lot of stuff going on there, and you'll see we throw in Katie Clyde, Katie Couric, and Samantha Power, and some other people that have stopped by just to show you the impact. Next slide. Okay, so this is a little bit more about what we do. We bring about $1 million a year in economic impact into the West Side, just based on money that's spent in our building, and then spent by people who are coming to our building and then going to other businesses on the street. So here's a little bit about what we do with our businesses. We do a lot of focus on business development. We have a 3-year curriculum where we work with people on things from as simple as getting an EIN or a taxpayer identification number for your business and DBA, all the way up to capital lending, to expansion planning, really anything that people need help with. Although our main focus really is on getting people to understand their finances, government regulations, and then prepare for hopefully larger capital infusions from institutions in the future. We also kind of serve as a cultural incubator for Buffalo, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. We can go to the next slide. Okay, perfect. So we also have kind of become this accidental cultural incubator for the city, where people can really come in for all different sorts of events and learn about different cultures through food. We find that food is probably the easiest way to really break cultural barriers. Everybody's always interested in like eating something new or trying something new. So it's one way that we've really been able to highlight all the different cultures on the West Side and really integrate them with the community at large and have people understand, where people are coming from. And usually doing that through food is really the easiest, I think, way for us to do it. And then the last thing I'll say, just because of the economic times we're in right now, CDFIs are going to be really important for small businesses. And if anybody works with small businesses who might really be seeing some adverse effects from everything that's going on right now, I would look for one in your area. They often have really low interest loans and a lot of tools to really help people navigate uncertain economic times, especially in areas like ours where banks are accused of things like redlining or not lending to people. We really can step in and lend to people that don't have any other options. So thank you.
Thank you, Bob. And India and Andrew, if you can also join us. And we will, I thought I'd start, so we developed this webinar, of course, and Bob, your last comments certainly feed into this, well before we knew there was going to be a pandemic. Just briefly, maybe if each of you could touch base and sort of, how are folks in your organizations responding to the situation we face ourselves in?
I'll start.
Okay.
These are definitely uncertain times. And as a person who is a single mother and, really has a passion for our community, I frankly am super impressed and heartened by the response of our local community organizations, individuals. I mean, there's an entire Buffalo solidarity network that's going on to make sure that everyone is taken care of. I feel like our employers have been super flexible, and most of us are working from home and being able to, self-quarantine and socially distance ourselves, as required. And I can't overstate how proud I am of Buffalo as a community for really rallying around one another and making sure that everyone's good.
Thanks.
Yeah, Push is a community-based organization, right? So our members have different needs all of a sudden. So that means we're doing a whole bunch of different work this week and trying to support a lot of these mutual aid and solidarity groups that are on the ground, organizing themselves and, offering our infrastructure, our space where appropriate. In my work, working with cooperative businesses, we've been trying to get some resources out there to folks, just general information, some of navigating the CDFI and small business lending opportunities or micro grant opportunities that might be out there, supporting workers at worker cooperatives access unemployment and things like that, and also seeing if there isn't some micro grant money that we can just change our budget around and suddenly start offering so that businesses can pay some crucial bills and so that workers can put food on the table. So it changes day to day, but we're working long days to try to make sense of it with the folks that need it.
Great, thanks, Bob.
I mean, we've seen a huge outpouring of community support. A lot of people are calling saying, what can I do to make sure I'm supporting the most vulnerable businesses in my community? And we're open for curbside. I've been there all morning running food out and putting it in people's trunks, and we'll keep doing that as long as we can. We're waiving our rent for now, so our businesses are operating rent-free. Unfortunately, a lot of our loan clients don't have that same opportunity, so we're going to be basically transitioning to spend our next 2 weeks just working on how we can secure disaster relief for a lot of the business owners we work with. And then unfortunately helping a lot of their employees navigate the unemployment system really until we can get them back employed. I think our main goal right now is how can we save these businesses so people have jobs to come back to and then bring them back as soon as we can. But we're just trying to get through it.
Yeah, of course, thanks. And I guess I'll just mention briefly, since Andrew and Bobby both mentioned CDFIs, but I know there's a call for from the Opportunity Finance Network, which is the CDFI trade association. They're seeking $1 billion in funding to get out to CDFIs. So just want to make sure folks on this webinar know about that. So I did want to ask, one thing I think that's important to recognize, both Weedy and Push Buffalo, you guys started as kind of ragtag groups 10 or 15 years ago, but you've really built up in scale. So, how was that done? And, say a little bit about the extent of the growth and what are some of the challenges that you've had to face while scaling?
Andrew, you want to start?
Sure. I could talk about this all day. I think living into our values as a organization that is member-led and member-driven, and trying to achieve the just transition that we want to, away from an extractive economy and toward a regenerative economy that works for all, involves us talking a lot about things like deep democracy and care and sacredness being at the center of our work. And that's one of those pieces that can often be hardest to do in practice. So I think as we continue to try to build the world we want to see, how are we doing that internally as an organization? And I think that's been one of the biggest challenges, and also like one of the most beautiful opportunities as an organization to really explore something that we're doing intentionally this year, more democratic processes as a workplace, as a nonprofit, and also making sure that we're accountable to our members. And we have some structures in place historically for that, where we have member committees that directly inform some of the more demonstration project work. Like we have a community development committee that informs the community development projects that we take on. And we have an economic democracy committee that has been very influential in the policy work that we'll do as far as moving toward a renewable future in New York State. So I think those are some of the ways, but as we continue to grow, we continue to need to make sure that we are being responsive to each other and leading by example.
Great, thanks, Bob.
And I would say, Push has always kind of been the leader in this, but we try to really grow through what the community or our community identifies as a need, or something that's not being filled by someone else. So micro lending back then was something that was really identified by the community as something nobody really had access to. So that's kind of how we got into that. And then, as things grew, we added education programs, and that really came out of a need identified in the community for extra help with kids who are going to school, maybe haven't been to school in years, probably don't speak English, and don't have anyone in their home that speaks English either. And then that kind of, the last piece of that was West Side Bazaar, which actually kind of became this physical space where people could even try to become entrepreneurs. A lot of the people that we work with come from the refugee community, and most of those people have degrees or a large amount of skill from their home country that they cannot use once they get to the United States. So helping people open a business is really just another way to try to help them reclaim their path to that middle class life they might have been used to before they had to flee. And then along with that, I mean, we have community members on all of our task force and all of our committees to make sure that what we're doing is actually filling a need. We're not an organization that'll say, oh, this looks like a great grant opportunity, we should chase this and make a new program. It's always, how can we make our program stronger? And how can we keep doing what we're doing well, and realize what other people are doing well and send people, where they need to go for other things.
Great, thanks. India, so I wanted to give you a chance to jump in. Obviously, you're at a startup stage, kind of where maybe Weedy and Bush were a decade ago. But what are some of the challenges that you faced as a startup, and how have you strategized around those?
Sure. Being a startup is hard work. And I do think that, too much to both Andrew and Bob's point, right? Like keeping the people who are impacted at the center becomes increasingly difficult as you look to fill skill sets, right? So we are the experts, but are we the experts in accounting? No. Are we the experts in affordable housing development? No. So there's a very steep learning curve when it comes to really fulfilling the mission of your organization. And I think that we are very fortunate to be able to rely on our partners for a lot of what we need when it comes to both capacity and just the knowledge that's required to fulfill our mission. But I think like the number one thing is like probably the obvious for any nonprofit leader, right? Funding, right? Funded. And there's no time to chase funding. There's no time to create new programs to fit into your philanthropic box. We need you to fund what we're currently doing. We need to be funding capacity and strategic planning. That is the answer. Like, pay people for their time and their knowledge and their experiential expertise. Everyone's not going to have a fancy degree, but there are folks who are in the community who will lend their time, and they do it all the time, and we just don't have the capacity to compensate them. But it's an important thing until we can really rebuild and create the economy that we're imagining. People still need money. So that's my number one answer: pay people and pay them well.
Well, that makes sense. Thanks. Andrew, I wanted to ask you about Cooperation Buffalo in particular, and how that effort is progressing.
I'm going to do that 3 more times. Cooperation Buffalo is a several-year-old effort to build out some infrastructure in Western New York, particularly for worker-owned businesses and cooperatives in general. And much to India's point, Cooperation Buffalo as a project is very much in its startup phase, and it owes much of its early success to relationships that we have with partners, a lot of them national. As much as we're trying to build a new thing and say no to the way much of the structures exist, we still need to work together to do so and not in isolation. And one of the key supports for Cooperation Buffalo has been being a part of a national CDFI called Seed Commons, which is a cooperatively managed loan fund that does loans in a non-extractive way specifically for cooperative businesses. And so we're one of several dozen members of that organization and part of the General Assembly that makes decisions on loans and what the process looks like for folks. But we also share even backbone fundraising, because it could be much easier for a national funder or a national organization to pool fundraising efforts for all of us smaller organizations in our individual places. And that's really helped us to keep staff and to do the work. We've successfully converted one childcare business on Buffalo's west side to worker ownership, and we just ran a cooperative academy training for 12 weeks in the fall, where we had 35 entrepreneurs learn about worker co-ops, and several of them were taking some of the first steps before things got a little crazy the past few weeks. So they're also part of the network when we're thinking about mutual aid. These folks that are even in the startup phase, are there things that we can do now for them to keep those projects in motion so that they can become co-ops in the future?
Great, thanks. Bob, I wanted to ask you about a little bit about Weedy, and it's become this center of refugee businesses. That wasn't quite the original design. So how did that happen? And what has been sort of the impact of those refugee-owned businesses on the West Side in Buffalo?
So the West Side's always been kind of a neighborhood with more of an immigrant feel. When my grandparents got to this country, I know my last name is Irish, but they were, on my mom's side, they're from Italy. That's where they settled, and it was a very Sicilian neighborhood. In the 70s, it kind of took on a very Latin American flavor, and then kind of has this international flavor now that all these refugee communities are coming in. So our original goal was really to work with the Latino community in the neighborhood on access to entrepreneurship. But as we kind of were founded and grew into this, it kind of coincided with this massive spike in refugee resettlement in Buffalo. For a little while, we were getting about 2% of all refugees resettled in the United States on the west side of Buffalo. So I think for a lot of reasons, that community was really responsive to the work that we do. I think a lot of the people we work with are professionals. I have teachers, I have pharmacists, I have bankers running businesses in the bazaar, because those skills and those degrees don't translate when they get to the United States. So I think for a lot of people in that community, they're looking for a way to open their own business as a way to not just go be, or not have to go into low wage work because they don't have the English skill, or not have any work at all because they don't have the English skills. So I think that's one reason that community was really responsive to the work that we do. And there's also, we don't do any marketing or advertising or anything really. There's a lot of word of mouth in those communities. So that's how most of our clients came to us. You know, we had 4 people come open businesses, and then all of a sudden everybody from their church or their kid's school or their community center or wherever was coming to us saying, I want to open a business too. I want to open a business too. So through doing that, we kind of became this center for people in the refugee communities to come and learn about business. We do a lot of workshops on financial literacy, so they can even just learn how do you open a bank account if you've never had one before. Can you open a bank account? Are you going to be able to get a line of credit? You know, we take on the riskiest loans in the community. We really only look at capacity and character. If someone seems like they're dedicated to their business, and we're not going to put them in a precarious financial position by giving them money, we will. So I think that's another thing that, you know, a lot of people have this idea that, well, nobody's ever going to give me money to start this business, but I mean, we kind of will, which is our biggest problem right now, is that we've taken on a lot of really risky loans, because it's really needed by the community. But it's kind of put us in a little bit of a precarious position too. And then lastly, we work with a lot of partner organizations in the community, so that when people do go out looking for services, they know, okay, if I want to start a business, Weedy's the place that I probably should go to learn about things like, how do I keep books? At what point do I need to worry about hiring people? What kind of insurances am I going to need? We have people on staff that know all of that. And then we do also intentionally try to hire from the communities, so that we have people on staff who can speak languages, who can communicate with people in those communities and make sure that access is there for people who really need it. So.
Great, thanks. India, I wanted to ask about, so that first slide you have is just very dramatic. There's the community, there's the anchor institution. So, you know, there's a lot that's been talked about in literature and so forth of anchor institution strategies, but, you know, how do you work either with those institutions or around them, as the case may be, to meet community needs?
That's a great question, and it is very loaded. I think that the number one priority for communities similar to mine is to create power among the community, and, you know, really harness that into political will. So where, you know, previously we were not a factor and not, you know, an entity as a neighborhood that the campus felt the need to negotiate with or approach, or you know, like everything was being done on top of. I think that right now we're in a position where people have to come to us to do other things. And I'm looking forward to seeing how our relationship with the medical campus continues to grow and change over time. But I think that we've progressed from a point of being largely ignored to at least being acknowledged as decision makers and as a force in our community. And we're very fortunate to have the support of our council person, who's also very influential. You know, so like people know that you can't come to the Fruitvale and just do what you want to do, right? Like there will be resistance, and there will be consequences, and you need to speak with us first. You can't make decisions and then come and we'll be the afterthought. And I think that that is the most important thing. But I think that, you know, across the board, we need for more large institutions to take responsibility for their impacts on communities. You know, and the bodies who govern them need to hold them accountable. It's not okay to write a report every 2 years and say that you're doing things and having impacts on communities that it's not true. And the folks who live there know that it's not true. Like what you're saying you're doing, you're not actually doing. And we need to hold their feet to the fire, make them do better. And that's what I wake up every morning to do. It's my goal and mission in life. And to train other people to do it too and empower them and let them know, like, it's okay. They have money and they're powerful, but they're not more powerful than you.
Great, thanks. Andrew, you want to jump in at all about like building power in communities? I know that's a big focus of Push's work, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, when folks know that Push is loading up a bus to go to Albany, that we're really serious about it. And at this point, it's kind of old hat for us and our community members, and it just takes one phone call and we've got an entire bus ready to go. And they're the issues that are most important right now. Our organizing team is focused on housing justice issues and climate justice, because that's the largest issue of our time. And as founding members of the statewide coalition, New York Renews, we were going back and forth to Albany pretty regularly, and nearly successfully ended up with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in New York State successfully last year, which did many of the things we were asking for, but not enough of them. And now we're organizing around the implementation strategy behind that, because it's great to get something passed that says, you know, governments have to do something, but it's another thing for those effects to actually reach the community in a meaningful way. And so part of our climate justice group organizing right now is around, you know, how do we make sure that these changes actually reach communities, that folks are actually hired from our communities for the jobs that are going to emerge as the green energy infrastructure grows in New York State. And yeah, so it's, yeah, building power is key for folks to take us seriously. And I think in Push's 15-year arc, it's folks know that we can do that at this point, and so they'll take our concerns seriously, which is an asset for the community, but it's still not enough. We still need the results.
Great, thanks. And we have a lot of good questions from the audience, so I'm sort of moving in that direction. There were some questions about, you know, funding. So, you know, who are some of the leading philanthropic partners that are supporting the work? And, you know, Bob, for you specifically, there was a question about, you know, where do you get the money to lend to other folks?
Yeah, so most of that would come from the SBA. As a CDFI, we can get money from the state and the federal SBA, and then our job is to loan that out. And then as people pay it back, we would pay it back. There's also a lot of grant opportunities. We have a lot of, you know, 100 years ago, Buffalo was one of the biggest and richest cities in the country. So there are still a lot of foundations here. Like I know you mentioned the Oshai Foundation in the beginning that sponsored some of this. They invented windshield wipers. So there's a lot of money from that still kind of around in local foundations that we get support from, and then private donations is a big piece of it too. And then for West Side Bazaar, we obviously have the rents from the businesses that help keep that stable and going, although we have a rent freeze going on there right now. And then additional funding from foundations and different government agencies to kind of supplement that.
Great, thanks. Andrew, yeah, either of you want to jump in?
We depend on the kindness of strangers. The first funding we ever got, interestingly enough, was from Aaron Bartley at Push Buffalo. So we do have a few large donors. We get some pass-throughs from local nonprofits. We were very fortunate to be a part of a round of funding through the New York State Attorney General's office that was specifically allocated for land trusts. So, we went from like operating with like $10,000 to operating with almost $1 million pretty much overnight. So like that was a stroke of luck and genius. But yeah, like we fundraise and scrape and scrounge just like every other nonprofit do-gooder organization does. But I think that the notion of permanent affordability is becoming more popular, and it's something that funders are increasingly interested in. I think that, right now we're at a point in time where we're really looking to try and circumvent the financial and philanthropic community and figure out like how we do this outside of depending on benevolent people to give, and how we establish alternate funding for mortgages, right? Like it's out there for small businesses, but similar to Wheaties model, right? Do you have the capacity? Do you have are you going to do the thing, right? Like I know people in the Fruit Belt who've been renting the same house for 15 years. So why can't we give you a mortgage? We know you're going to pay it, right? So that's where we currently are. So yeah, but it'll happen.
Great. Andrew, anything you want to add?
I mean, just briefly, our mix is some national funding, some of the local foundations, definitely some small dollar, large dollar donors. Push is a complex animal, so our community development projects, there's a certain amount of revenue that we'll bring in from the tenants, but because they're low income, often those projects are pretty heavily subsidized through other sources, and the maintenance of them as well. And I think, I don't know, India alluded to it earlier, and I think it's important every chance we get to call out the philanthropic community. There was a thing that happened in 2008 in that financial crisis moment when a lot of funders pulled back because they had lost a bunch of money on Wall Street and got really scared. And I think we want to make sure that doesn't happen in this moment where Wall Street is on uneasy footing, and we need that money out in communities, not invested in stocks and bonds. I think continuing to put the pressure on the philanthropic community to give and to release that money in a way that actually supports our communities is really key. And then making sure we can keep it recirculating in those communities through loan funds like Wheaties CDFI, and also like the Seed Commons, the cooperative loan fund that we're a part of. Once we capture that money and circulate it through businesses that can be productively sustainable, and then support new businesses that can be productively sustainable and keep that money in workers' pockets, then we're doing something right. So
great, thanks. And Nonprofit Quarterly's actually called on philanthropy to double their existing grants, in the emergency situation. So we hope that call is heeded. India, interesting question came in. Being an RN is not the perhaps most typical background for what you're doing now as executive director of a community land trust. But how do you feel like that professional experience prepared you for what you're doing now?
That is a good question. So nurses are natural advocates, right? Like that's what we do for a living. We go to work every day. We put our own lives and health and safety at risk often for other folks. So for me, it was a very natural transition. Before I was executive director, I actually quit my job to be a community organizer. I worked on criminal justice and police reform. And I think that for me, like it goes from taking care of a vulnerable patient to taking care of a vulnerable community, right? Like what are the things that we do to prevent people from entering into the healthcare system to begin with, right? My last nursing job, I was a school nurse, and no child came to me because they were sick. They came to me because they were tired. They came because they were hungry. They came because there was violence in their home. They had no refuge. Like most kids came because they just wanted a nap or a place where they felt safe, a place where they could cry and like have someone understand what they were going through, or like get a granola bar. Right. So like now how do I take this and scale it to a level where there's an impact that's beyond what is my little nursing office and my 500 students? And I thought that organizing was a great way to do that. And I think the challenge of being an organizer prepared me for what I'm doing right now. You don't always have all of the answers, but if you can form the relationships that help get you there, that is the thing that is important. And like, I think that like nursing is a natural progression for me into the foray of just creating community.
Great, thanks. So another good question that came in was, we talk often about the importance of partners in this work, right? And yet, partners mean negotiation. So, I mean, sometimes you have to give a little, how do you build the partnerships you need and maintain the community accountability that's so important to the work?
I'm happy to chime in.
Okay, go for it.
I think that one of the most important things that we experienced in the Fruit Belt was always just keeping the people who live there in the center, right? Like there were lots of partners, but if you didn't have agreement among the leadership from the neighborhood, nothing moved. I think that is paramount to making partnerships successful. And I also think that there's this equity lens that we need to view everything through, right? If you're a bigger organization with more resources and more capacity, then you should be willing to give a little bit more to smaller orgs. And, we just got to be honest and transparent with one another. And that's the way that I feel like partnerships work best is, I just go into the meeting like, hey, I need today from you. Can you? And you either say yes or no. And if you say no, then you're going to help me find out who else can. So that's how we do it.
Great. Thanks. Andrew, I'm going to ask you a question about, I got a couple questions about co-op development and, if a community is starting to look at building a worker co-op ecosystem, which obviously is part of, big part of the program you're directing, what are some of the initial steps to starting to get actual traction to do that?
I mean, similar to land trusts, like India was talking about earlier, there's also increased national attention, both from funders and just from like movement folks into community ownership and cooperatives. So I think definitely tapping into what's there in this moment politically, and with some of the partners like the Seed Commons Community Wealth Fund that I talked about, and the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives and the Democracy at Work Institute are great sort of resources to definitely cull from, because there's a lot of templates that can be used in communities. But the real first step is like to understand your community's relationship to cooperatives. There are probably a number of co-ops or collectives that may be working in the visible economy, some in the invisible economy, and there's certainly some that have cropped up in different eras of American history that I think it's really important to recognize. One of the things that we constantly have to fight about as far as narrative in Buffalo goes is, we have a number of high-profile cooperatives, food co-ops that mainly serve natural foods to the upper middle-class white community, and a lot of folks in Black and brown communities don't feel like co-ops are for them. And yet, the history of cooperatives in Buffalo is far richer in communities of color than it is in the white community, and I think making sure that those stories are told, that those folks who might still be around, that have ties to the co-ops that existed in past moments of economic strife can tell their stories, and that history isn't erased and can be like, folks can identify with it, is really, really key. And so that's some of the work that we're trying to do to make sure that folks understand that like this is a mutual aid and mutual support structure that has existed for a long time, especially in communities that are not welcome in the mainstream economy, and that's why we're doing this work. So yeah, get connected to your folks that are already doing that kind of work, because they're there somewhere.
Okay, thanks. There was a question that's asked, well, a couple questions about, what, and it kind of comes down to, so Andrew, you're working on co-op development, and Bob, you're working more on micro entrepreneurship. What are sort of the factors that you think about, like, well, this is really an effort that should be a co-op, or this is really an effort that should be an individual business? How do you decide, what to support and and guide people through those choices?
I think for us, it's kind of what people think to run their own business. If they want to establish a co-op, we can fund something like that. If they want to establish, an LLC, we can talk about doing that and fund that. If they are establishing some kind of sole proprietorship business where they're just going to be running it, we'll fund that. So I think it's kind of really up to the entrepreneurs we work with to say, this is what I want to do. Certainly we can work with people like the Small Business Development Center or other partners in Buffalo to say, this is probably what's best for you and your business. But it all really focuses around that entrepreneur and what they specifically need. Everybody's needs are very unique and very different. So it's kind of more about case-by-case basis for us.
Great. Andrew, anything, you've helped different types of businesses at different times. I'm aware of that. So any thoughts?
Right. Yeah. My prior work before joining with Push and Cooperation Buffalo was I spent 6 years at the Buffalo SBDC helping all sorts of entrepreneurs, and many of them were staid micro entrepreneurs. And in that sense, if it's only ever going to be a business that's really going to put food on the table for one or two people, it essentially can offer a partnership is essentially a co-op if there's, equal enough ownership and profit sharing, and maybe that's as big as the business grows, but especially if it is something that can pool a lot of resources, provide a lot of jobs, and also if folks just feel politically inclined or motivated to make sure that it has that sort of like real ownership for all of the workers involved and the real wealth building for everybody across the board, then that's a good candidate to me. But co-ops are successful in every single industry. So it's not really a matter of one being better or the other. It's just there's different regulatory problems that will come up because co-ops exist just a little bit outside of the traditional small business structures. And so sometimes, things will come up in that regard.
Great. So India, there was a question for you about the Community Land Trust and its bylaws and so forth. Are those publicly available? And if so, how can people access those? Or should they reach out to you directly?
I'm trying to think if they're publicly available. They should be. I'll call our web designer, put them up on the website. But you can reach out to me directly. There's nothing that is secret about them. Most of it comes from the expertise of our friends at Grounded Solutions Network and Mike Brown of Burlington Associates. Most land trusts have very similar bylaws where you have a tripartite board, a third made up of residents of the community, a third made up of actual land trust lessees, and a third public seats, so that the majority is always the folks who matter. But yeah, you can reach me at India at fbcommunitylandtrust.org. It might take me a couple days to get back to you. I'm a single employee. It's just me that works there, but I'll respond eventually. You know that, Steve.
Thanks. So there was an interesting question about the one of your slides, Andrew, with the hiring hall. Sort of clearly not everyone got hired out of the hiring hall. What sort of, in just like not every business that goes through the incubator actually succeeds, but sort of what were the paths? So if you didn't get a job through the hiring hall, what support was Push able to provide?
Yeah, the hiring hall exists in this weird space on the spectrum of all the work that Push does between, stopping the bad and building the new. And the hiring hall is kind of squarely in the middle. It's actually a little bit more on that stopping the bad side of things, that we're trying to get folks jobs in the existing extractive economy that might be excluded from it otherwise. And with forcing that issue comes a lot of challenges with actually getting people work. The hiring hall, in addition to just trying to place folks at jobs and sometimes doing direct hires through us essentially as a staffing agency, we do a really robust set of just general like worker training, everything from like resumes and job coaching to particular training for the construction trades and green construction trades. So we're developing programs for folks to get into the solar trades right now, and we're looking at things like geothermal and other areas. And so those skills are going to be useful even if we don't have a job immediately to place them at. And so really all we're doing is just trying to provide as much support as we can in that space, and also understand the limitations of trying to get people into industries that are, often incredibly sexist, often very racist. And so there's a lot of ways in which we then have to do some of that organizing with the contractors that we're trying to place folks at to make sure that they're pushing in a direction where their policies and procedures as a company are going to be an environment where that worker can survive longer than one job that takes a month, right? And we've had success and failure with that, and we actually just had a discussion about this recently, where we realized we needed to get back on the developer and construction company organizing track a little bit more and start applying more pressure, because we're seeing some of our workers not have as good situations there. And obviously one of the things that we can do as a community developer ourselves is build buildings, build affordable housing, and create jobs where we can place folks, in those fields as direct placements, or negotiated as part of our contracts with the developers that we bring into those projects. But those obviously end. And so that's the nature of construction work, is it's job by job. So I think some of the direction, the long-term direction for our hiring hall might actually be more focused on cooperative development, on getting people trained in these areas, continuing to push legislation that creates more need for development projects to include green construction, green energy, and things like that, and then be building a worker-owned company on the side out of our hiring hall workers that can meet that need and can stay in business for itself and be actually community-owned rather than a social enterprise that's nonprofit-owned, which has its strengths sometimes, but also definitely has its weaknesses.
Great, thanks. Bob, you want to say anything about, so the folks who don't, their business doesn't pan out, is there any follow-up with Weedy afterwards, or, how do they end up faring after that?
It kind of depends. We'll connect. We have really good relationships with most of our clients. We can connect them to a lot of different services. But the main thing, or the main takeaway there, is that if you're going to open a restaurant, it's probably, I don't know, at least $50,000 that you're going to probably need up front. You can open in West Side Bazaar with $2,000. So you're losing a lot less money if you're going to fail. And I mean, realistically, 2/3 of restaurants fail in a few years. So if we can get that number down to even a third, for us, that's a victory. And a lot of people think they're going to be a great entrepreneur because they're a great cook. It doesn't always work out that way. But it's better to find out before you sunk your entire life savings or taken out a huge loan from a bank that you're going to be on the line to pay back. If you go about it doing it in a model like this, where you're only on the line for rent and your food costs, and then if you get to the point where you need an employee to help you out and you can hire one, great. But it really allows people to scale up kind of at their own speed based on what different constraints they have, whether it's a language barrier, whether it's financial barrier, whatever. We really try to just lessen the amount of barriers, so there's less opportunities to fail and then less costs associated with that. So sometimes the biggest success story is somebody failing for not spending any money rather than sinking their whole life savings into something.
No, exactly. Thanks. So there was a question that was asked about, to what degree are you guys able to collaborate among each other in some of your work? Maybe you can jump into that.
Yeah. I mean, we'll collaborate with literally anybody that wants to collaborate. Most of the time we work with resettlement agencies on just making sure when they bring people here, people know you can come here, you can find food that's familiar, you can speak your language, people will help you find access to things. So those are our most core partnerships. There are other CDFIs that we can say, okay, this client's taken 2 loans from us, they've paid them back. They're ready to expand. We can't give them more than $20,000. Can you do some bridge financing? Can you take on a larger loan and get this person more capital? So we work with those, and then just a lot of smaller community organizations. Like right now, we're working with a farm out in East Aurora, which is a pretty wealthy suburb, where there's a group of Somali Bantu who have been farming this land. Somebody donated 14 acres. So we're working with them on how can they know the farm side of things, how can we teach their farmers the business side of things so that they know how do you keep a ledger, how do you do a profit and loss statement, how do you do any of this, how do you market, So we'll step in for things like that, whenever we can. And then, yeah.
Great, thanks. Andrew, a question came in for you about if you had any business data in terms of, I don't know, co-op success rates vis-a-vis standard private businesses.
Not any that I can rattle off the top of my head. And that data is a little hard to come by just because, especially in the worker cooperative sector, there's not a lot of worker co-ops in the US. There are many in other parts of the world. But I will say that the US Federation of Worker Co-ops and Cooperative Development Foundation have put out some good materials, and it does seem to be time and again there are employee retention is higher, success in downturns is higher because co-ops will actually like reorganize their workforce, or everybody takes a pay cut to keep the business that is providing everybody's livelihood in business. And also there's some really good data that's starting to come out of folks looking at how ethical the worker co-op sector is compared to other businesses. And the US Federation, I think, just put out their worker co-op census for the last year they had data for, and found that the top to bottom pay ratio at co-ops was 2 to 1, which is very, very different than other, especially large US companies. And so yeah, the data is pretty compelling. And one of the reasons why we're trying to make sure that a lot of that is out there is we are in this moment where we've got so many boomers that own small businesses that are probably going to be retiring or looking to close down, and their children may not want to take on those businesses, and they may end up liquidating them. They may sell them to private equity folks, and it's going to have terrible impacts on our main streets. And one of the best strategies for what to do with these businesses is just selling them to the workers who have also been keeping these places running for decades. And so we're really trying to get the word out to local business associations and small business owners, especially those that are going to enter this retirement phase in the next 5 to 10 years, to like take this seriously. And the data shows it's a really safe thing to do with your business, if not the best thing to do with it.
Great, thanks. So I think I'll ask one last question, which is, this is kind of an interesting question that came in. It was really about, is there an advantage to, do you feel like there's a different feeling in Buffalo because it's a, city of, 250,000? It's not New York City, and that allows for, a different sense of solidarity within the community.
I mean, we are the city of good neighbors. So I think that's, that's kind of a mentality. I drive a really small car, get stuck in the snow all the time. Strangers push me out. Like, people are always here to help each other. And I think one thing that's really for us, I know in a lot of other places in the country, you see a lot of kind of anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-refugee sentiment. We don't really experience that too much in our neighborhood anyway, because people have seen that, people are coming into our neighborhood, they're opening businesses, they're bringing a street, Grant Street. When I was a little kid going to visit my grandparents, there was a lot of closed, empty spaces. So now to see all these different halal markets and Burmese markets and different businesses, I think people are really welcoming and appreciative of the fact that, we're.
Great. India, you want to jump in at all? Last comment?
I don't think the solidarity economy is like exclusive to smaller cities. I think this is something that is catching on. I think that what is happening in Buffalo is maybe a small ember that is likely to catch fire, especially with what is happening right now. And I know that for us, a lot of our partners are national people, right? Like we, get lots of help from folks down in New York City and, in the Bay Area. And like there are large cities where this is happening on a much larger scale. I think maybe the story's amplified because we're in a smaller place. But I think that this is a trend that we'll see continue to grow in both cities, small and large.
Great. Well, with that, I think we should wrap up, and we're at time. So I want to thank Bob Doyle from Weedy, India Walton from Fruitvale Community Land Trust, Andrew Del Monte from Push Buffalo, and all of you for showing up and participating and providing so many great questions. thanks so much, and we'll be back, I guess, pandemic willing, the third Thursday of April, looking at other fantastic community building efforts in Fresno, California. So thanks to everyone so much.